Hello, everybody. Welcome on the Lights on Data show. Today, we're going to talk about mining the past and seeing how we can make all data to be valuable.
And our guest today is Ryan Hum. Welcome, Ryan.
Hi.
Ryan is the Chief Data and Information Officer and VP at Canada Energy Regulator. Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I guess you already know my name and my title. I was a former data scientist and a designer. So that's how I got into the space, a little bit of a UX, strategic service design angle. I studied engineering and biology and public health. And yeah, as much of us, like many of us do, we just wander around the world until we find data as our home.
Oh, wow. That's so poetic.
Does that sound familiar, George?
I love it. It's true. I feel so many people really fall into it, and especially within the data management, data governance space. I feel like you're just growing into the role and finding about it and then taking it on. But Ryan and I actually met a few months ago at a Vancouver conference, your conference in Vancouver called, I think it was the Big Data Analytics West Summit.
I think
And Ryan had one of the keynotes, and it was really one of the most memorable, impactful ones that I've attended. And it was all about how data is about culture and innovation and had a really warm story to it. And what really drew me to his story was that the work that Ryan is doing, his team is doing, is really impacting communities. So you can see direct relationship between data and how it's affecting people. And that's one of the things that I want to talk to you about today.
awesome. And I don't know if you remember, but my keynote, I never mentioned the words data management ever. In another space, it's all we did was data management.
Right. It was all about the storytelling and the human factor of it. And I think that's what really made people pay attention and get it, be engaged.
Awesome.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure. So the Canada Energy Regulator, or formerly known as the National Energy Board, has been around for about 60 plus years. Most people know us as regulating pipelines. So that could be Trans Mountain, Keystone XL, a whole bunch of other ones. And in that regulatory process, companies and stakeholders have to submit data that would help us make a decision on whether or not we should approve or not approve a pipeline. And that data it just covers everything. There's things like noise volumes from construction to orca whales to caribou migration paths and permafrost data and medicinal plants used in indigenous communities. So we get so much. But like any non-digitally native company or organization, especially one that started 60 years ago or even further, the precursor of it was paper, right? So I oftentimes say that the Canada Energy Regulator is the one of the best information data repositories there is that's hidden to the public.
Right.
Especially on social, environmental, indigenous knowledge. So we went on a journey to extract all of that and make it accessible to people. And so that means taking out all the tables, maps, and figures out of thousands and thousands of documents so that people could search it. So that if you type in orca whale, you could get all the different submissions, all the different tables, all the different sources and page numbers and table IDs for that data across decades. And then we've started doing this also for Indigenous knowledge as well. So a ton of knowledge comes to us from Indigenous communities, and that could be, I talked about medicinal plants, it could be oral policies, sacred site, it could be impacts on residential schools or missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, right? And especially the traditional knowledge, oftentimes that's being lost. It's only
Mm-hmm.
being held by so few people in the community. And so we've been trying to identify the owners of this knowledge and repatriating it back to those elders and those communities.
Which answers one of the questions here that Case Trashny had. It's what represents all data, and I think you've exemplified it very well. And it's really amazing how much data you're gathering and how much of it is unstructured, but then you're trying to make some meaning out of it and empower people then to access it and use it and draw information back from it. And can you tell us a little bit about the impact that it has had on the local communities that you've engaged with?
We're still early on the journey. Sometimes I forget the data science part of it, or extracting it, seems oftentimes the coolest part and sometimes the hardest part, right? Especially unstructured data. And I just missed the mark in terms of how hard it is to engage with communities. Right. And so after we extracted a lot of the data and we wanted to go back to communities, I started talking to different elders about how to do it in an ethical space. And I realized I didn't know anything. And so we gathered about 20 plus traditional knowledge keepers in Treaty 6 and Treaty 7 to actually guide us in how we do that. What is sacred? What is not sacred? What is the power of this data? Right. And so I'll give you one example. The elders told us that some of the knowledge, we have to be careful not to classify it as sacred. Because when you over classify something as sacred, then the access to it gets lost. And that actually hurts the community more. These little nuances that we didn't know about. One of the other elders told us that in Blackfoot, there is no word for museum in their language. And that the closest equivalent to that is Death Lodge, where data
Wow.
and information or products or artifacts or bundles go to die. That's where they are inactivated and not being used by the community. Really interesting way of framing what a museum is, right?
I'm getting shivers down my spine when I'm hearing this, and it really makes you think the whole idea of the museum, and is it a positive thing? Is it a negative thing? What we can do better to not squash the representation of those objects or whatever we're putting in that community, but still having it as a way to bring the community together,
Yeah.
extend that knowledge forward.
Yeah, it's really changed my mind in terms of like Western mind frames around data and information management. But what he was trying to say is those are living things. That knowledge is living. And if you put it aside, it's no longer contributing to society anymore.
Absolutely. Susan Walsh, the classification guru, is here as well. I'm seeing that she's finding this very interesting. I think a lot of this speaks to all of us, even if we might not have that close relationship from a historical point of view. Yeah.
I do have a question here, and mm, it's so weird. We were talking about data and how you got into data, but you are doing very interesting things with the data. I think very few people work with data in this way and having this type of impact and giving it this type of meaning. So I'm just wondering how you got to do this and what attracted you in this path. What led you?
I think there's two things that are different in my life that led me to data, right? I don't think you need to hear about the technical path and all that kind of stuff. But one is I'm a product designer by training.
Right.
So I went into engineering and then into product design. And at the master's level product design, which I was completely naive about, I thought that we were going to build things, right? And reality is they assume because you have a bachelor's in a technical area, you know how to build things. And so what our program did that I took taught you about where ideas come from and how to create better ideas, right? How do you know that those ideas are relevant? How do you know that product idea is relevant? And centered in all my product design masters was ethnographic research methods, anthropology, right? How do you actually talk to people? How do you actually run a focus group? How do you actually watch someone fly in the wall and observe all the things that a user doesn't even know that they're doing and doesn't know how to tell you about them? right?
Mhm.
And so I was trained in all of that. How do you come up with new ideas, but also how do you prototype ideas with people so you actually know whether or not they're going to be useful? And so really helpful in the UX product design space, testing, data visualizations, all that kind of stuff. Digital space uses it all the time. I think that I naturally applied that to data as well. So that's one area that, so co-designing how we steward this information and repatriate it back with communities was more natural because that was originally my design space. That was part of our design process. The second is about 6.5 years ago, I adopted a little boy who's Indigenous.
Wonderful.
Yeah, so since birth, and there's all these horrific horror stories around of parents robbing the kids of their culture. And I didn't want that to be how we raised our kids. And so my partner and I, over the last 6 years, ever since he was born, have been on this, our elders call it a red road. How do we actually, so I don't identify as Indigenous, I'm Chinese, but how does our family identify as Indigenous? How do we make it so that my son can confidently identify as Indigenous? And so we've surrounded ourselves with elders,
Mm.
surrounded ourselves with people that could teach us these ways. And so when I came about this knowledge that we have in our repositories, I brought tobacco with me. We were going to a powwow to see an elder and do a pipe ceremony. And so before the pipe ceremony, I pulled her aside and I said, Elder, I have some tobacco for you. Come sit with me and read this. And it was actually her hearing her testimony at our organization about Trans Mountain. And she completely forgot about it. We together reading her own testimony. And then we started talking about what's the next step. Okay, so now I understand you and I are crying about this, and that this knowledge is useful to the community and to the children of the community. How do we actually go about this? And so over the next 2 years, we actually tried figuring that out.
This is so beautiful.
You're such a great storyteller, Ryan,
Yeah.
and I mentioned this to you before. A fun fact about tobacco that I found out as well, visiting a medicine garden a few years ago at UBC. UBC has one of the medicine gardens that's part of the UBC farm, and apparently did get an award Canada-wide a couple of years ago for it. But tobacco, apparently, it's a remedy for headaches. Who knew? Yeah.
Probably a lot of smokers.
Yeah. But Ryan, I remember you're mentioning to Scott Taylor and I that you often read stories or make up stories to your son, and that really helped you in your storytelling skills, abilities, and growing that up. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, or give us some tips on how can we become such a great storyteller as you are?
Oh, I don't know. That's a question that I wasn't expecting at all. I think that there's some of us that are natural at that, right? When you go up the chain in an organization, you have to get better at briefings, right? And especially when you're in very technical subject matter, your higher ups may not actually be technical, right? So in the public service, we have ministers, right? And ministers come from every background, right? Not even have the subject matter expertise in that area. And so you learn to translate your stories into metaphors or analogies, right? I remember one where I was trying to describe what a tailings pond was in mining, right? And I used to call it an large above ground pool that we put the tailings into and cover it in water so that they have a visual image of what that actually. And then the way that you brief sometimes has to fit how they're receiving it. I remember one time I read a lot of newspapers, right? They're completely sensitive to the news, and some other senior managers are not. And I remember having this idea of there's this social impact that will happen with this mining project. And so I found an article of a mine that I knew had this challenge, and I wrote on a post-it note, this could happen here. And I sent it up. That was my briefing note. this could happen here. I think you really do have to think about how you connect with people. With my son, he's just such a natural. Maybe I'm just being culturally biased, but there is this oral storytelling, oral tradition, less written down
Yeah.
passing of language or
Yeah.
stories and policies and like morals in his culture, right?
Mm.
I can't remember, somewhere I picked it up that this was easy for him. And so when we went to bed at night, instead of reading stories, we would start up our own story. Once upon a time, there was and then he would fill in bear and three cubs. And that bear and three cubs met a friend, a blue jay. So we just go back and forth. And then I tried to wrap the story into something so that it has like this nice little arch and then this like in French, déroulement, and then
I love
That's
it.
beautiful.
So you're practicing together,
we
right? So he's teaching you, you're teaching him.
he'll rock it really soon.
I love it. So what I'm hearing from you is that you're really thinking about the audience first, right? And what good gets to them. And truly, people remember stories more than anything, right? And
And
listening to you. Yep.
yeah, this is exactly the point, right? Like people will remember, oh, extracting this traditional knowledge from elders, and then repatriating it. I never said data management, right?
Yes.
I would say it's almost never in my vocabulary, especially to senior management, because if you start with data management, I mean, do I know that it's important? Absolutely. But you lose the so what? You lose the punchline of the story. And if you think about all these sports heroes and whatever, like you highlights at the end of a game. You don't have highlights of their training program that they use for the game. And you can do that after they become a star. And when there's this life story about them and their like journey, that becomes more compelling. But snippets, you're only talking about the highlights of the game, not, that LeBron James did 14,323 shots in the basket at these 14 different points in 5 days before. No, you don't talk about that kind of stuff. Right? It's not compelling.
Yes. And I think what I love listening to you is that you talk with a lot of emotion. And I think that is also what
Mhm.
reaches people directly where it has to. Ryan, I'm just curious, like a little parenthesis here. I know you're working towards a PhD. What is the topic? Is it connected to what we were just talking about?
Yeah, my like super long PhD that like at some point I have to finish. And you broke the cardinal rule. You're not supposed to talk about it.
Yeah, I actually understand because I'm doing mine as well, and
That's
it's
worse.
weighing
You
heavy.
knew. You knew not to bring it up.
Oh,
I was really lucky in starting my PhD. I have this weird background, right? I'm an engineer, biologist, product design, and I worked in the government for a long time. And for a while, I didn't know how these connected together. And so at one point in my life, my partner and I were leaving the city. And I thought, oh, I'll take this time to find a new job and I'll just chat with people and see what people are doing that's of interest. And maybe it's time for me to actually use my academic backgrounds. And I met this prof who was studying this concept of global engineering, right? And at that point, she didn't know much. She had this hypothesis that engineers don't solve global problems. We're super educated and we have complex math skills like superpowers. And then you're optimizing a process for a oil and gas company by 0.0001%, which could be profit margins of $1 billion, is actually saving the world. And the answer is maybe not. And so when I started, she said, I don't know what it is, but I know that you want to look at these kind of problems and you want to use your skills to solve these types of problems. And so I went in completely without a thesis, which was a really neat luxury that a lot of people don't have in a way, like so much freedom. I ended up doing I was studying how ideas scale. So the concept was we know how to save a child's life. Number three, we know how to cure whatever it is. Yet in low and middle income countries, they're not doing it, or they can't do it. Right? I shouldn't put this moral aside. So I looked at how social innovation scaled, how medical innovation scaled. That turned into more of a I just fell into this mathy, econometric, epidemiological model. I use like weird engineering math skills to study global health trends. So looking at, how R&D has changed the cost of living for the better for children, made it cheaper and cheaper to get access to these medications, but the same is not actually happening for adults. And so how do I actually prove that? How do I pull that all out? And I used to joke that children are sexy. I know, but funding childhood diseases, funding all this stuff in low and middle income countries pulls at your heartstrings, and people put a lot of money into it. But there's less in saving a 42-year-old male's life. And so you're actually starting to see that in the costs of these like health technologies is we have more and more of them that are available, but they're only available in high income countries because the cost structure hasn't been scaled so that it actually is cheaper and cheaper for these countries.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's my PhD in a
That
nutshell.
sounds really interesting. And the question that comes to mind is that you're doing so many impactful things. So you're doing this PhD, you're working with the communities, your work every day has a lot of, maybe you're also a professor. And I'm just wondering, out of all these things, which one brings you the most satisfaction?
Parenting.
Parenting, I love it.
Yeah.
That's a full-time job and a lifetime one, of
It
course, as
is.
well.
It is. Lots of frustrations. I mean, if you think that you get upset about cleaning data, right? Parenting is worse. Cleaning after kids is way worse than cleaning up. I can tell you that. There's no script that you could write.
Not yet.
Yes, and sometimes even the storytelling skills are not enough. I have one more question.
Yeah, go ahead.
And yes, and that is, you were saying that you are at the beginning with this data work, and I was wondering what are the next steps, and maybe
So
what is the vision of the outcome?
a couple things. So us, actually, there's a couple of different areas. On the Indigenous side, we took one of the easier subsets of our repository to start organizing, tagging, understanding which elders were where and how are they represented and how do we actually identify owners. And we started putting together this circle of knowledge keepers to tell us, to guide us on how we actually do that. We're at the final stages. In about a week or two, we're going to have hopefully our last elders knowledge circle where they give us these this mandate of how we're supposed to go about it. And then from there, we're actually going to start going out into the communities and start giving it back and having ceremony around us, if that's what they want to do. But I say that for all that we've done around data management and cataloging and meta tagging and extracting out, we've done about 2% of our knowledge keepings.
Wow.
And so we actually have so much more that we could do. I'm hopefully going to be launching a project at UBC with our data and Data for Social Good fellowship program around looking through all the evidence that's being submitted to us as a quasi judicial court and identifying who gave us that evidence. And so if a First Nation came to us and said, give us all the information that our community has ever given you, we actually know how to do that and how to find it. Because right now, I'm not sure if I could. That's one side. And then the other side, on the environmental side, we've gotten really good about extracting these tables, maps, figures out of these environmental documents, but we haven't added an algorithm to add locations to it,
Hmm.
right? And so if you don't have these templates, people will use city names, neighborhoods, provinces, lat longs, UTMs, like there's a whole variety of different things. There's one in the pipeline industry where it's like linear milepost or something like that, where it's the 110th mile from the very beginning of the. How do you actually translate all these?
Hmm.
So when we actually extract all these tables, maps, figures, that there's a location specific to it. Right now we have something similar, and we could say, oh, it's from this pipeline, for example, and so they know, okay, well, it spanned just Alberta in this localized area, but we'd like to add some of these extra elements to it and then start using more AI machine learning to actually do this automatically when documents come to us. I think that's one of the big things in a lot of data management. A lot of organizations want to change the human, right? Oh, there's this secretary or this officer who signs off on this document and then needs to add it into this database afterwards or whatever. And the reality is everyone's busy and you're trying to add on this extra job for everyone so that you can have cleaner data at the end. Machine learning cloud is actually really fantastic now. And so we've been exploiting this API that we have in one of our legal repositories. And so every single time, every night, we scan, okay, did this type of document get added into our repository? Yeah, go into Appendix A and extract these 17 variables out of there, right?
Hmm.
How do we actually do that more and more?
Yeah, long journey ahead.
Yeah. But
But I
it's fun.
feel it is fun. Yeah, I can see the fun in it. And I think that so many other industries and organizations will be able to benefit from your learnings. And it sounds like it's something that's scalable to others too.
Absolutely. The key is just to hire really amazing, caring, and brilliant staff.
Always,
Yeah.
always. All right. Thank you so much for being on the Lights on Data show with us and sharing these amazing stories with a huge impact.
Thank you so much, George and Tiana. And by the way, I wore this yellow cardigan just for Scott.
Wow.
I'm sure he would appreciate that. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to join us live today, but I'm sure that he will watch the recording, and I'll make sure that I'm going to tell him, "Hey, Ryan, wear the hoodie." And as he also bought a hoodie, I think exactly the same, but in purple. It's so impactful and it's so on brand. I need to learn from it.
Thank you so much for the invite. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.